Well, a good morning to you, mixed martial arts fans. It is time now for the official UFC 219 weigh-ins. I'm Ariel Helwani. I'll be with you for the next 2 hours as we run through tomorrow night's card. 20 fighters total will be stepping on that scale here. We're inside the MGM Grand Conference Center, and well, there's no doubt about it. There is a ton of intrigue surrounding one fighter in particular on this card. His name is Khabib Nurmagomedov, and everyone wondering if he is going to, in fact, make weight in a matter of moments. There's some talk that he will be one of, if not the first fighter to step on that scale. We await with bated breath the arrival of the Eagle. Of course, the main event is Cris Cyborg versus Holm for the UFC Women's Featherweight title. There is all kinds of intrigue heading into Saturday night. This historically is one of the UFC's biggest events of the year. It's their year-end event. It's not the event that they had hoped would happen. Tomorrow night at the T-Mobile Arena, there were some big names, some big fights scheduled for this card. Unfortunately, some of those have fallen through, but we still have a solid 10-fight card that is hopefully going to remain intact as Saturday night comes around. There you see the head of the Athletic Commission here in Nevada, Mr. Bob Bennett, checking the scale. It appears as though we are getting set for the official weigh-ins.
Cynthia Calvillo?
And first up will be Cynthia Calvillo, one of the top stars in the UFC's women's strawweight division. What a year it has been for her. She is hoping to go 4-0 in 2018. In fact, this morning I was on the treadmill and had the pleasure of working out right next to Cynthia Calvillo as she was shedding those final pounds. There's nothing more impressive than seeing an athlete who is clearly tired, clearly dehydrated, waking up early in the morning to shed those final pounds. The fight before the fight, it is something few athletes are asked to do, and these particular athletes do it time in and time out. They keep coming back for more. So there you see Cynthia Calvillo undressing. She's got the hoop surrounding her, and she's about to step on the scale. Of course, she's scheduled to meet Carla Esparza in a very important fight at 115 pounds. And she hits her mark. That's 116 pounds for Cynthia Calvillo. She is the first fighter to step on the scale. She's the first fighter who is official for UFC 219. And how about this story? What a turn of events here in Las Vegas. The second person to arrive, the second person to step on the scale, will be none other than the one and only Khabib, the Eagle, Nurmagomedov. You see him off to the side. He is standing by with his manager, Ali Abdelaziz. Before we get to him, we will allow Cynthia Calvillo to pose for the cameras. She puts up her number one. She's hoping to become the number one contender in the strawweight division. But the real story, my friends, is this. Here he comes. What a story. What symbolism. 9 months ago, we were here in Las Vegas awaiting the arrival of Khabib Nurmagomedov. He asked us if we were waiting for him. We were certainly doing that. He did not show up for the weigh-ins at 209. He is here as the second fighter to weigh in for 219. What a story. Looks to be in phenomenal shape. Great spirits, a smile on his face. And he hits his mark, 155.5 for Khabib Nurmagomedov. You have to believe that there is a massive amount of pressure now lifted off his shoulders. The pride of Dagestan. So many jokes, so many comments made, so many critiques about whether or not he would make this weight. He makes the weight successfully, and now he can focus on Saturday night and his important fight against Edson Barbosa. We move right along and say hello to Dan Hooker, who meets Marc Casey on Saturday. What a year it has been for Dan Hooker. Not only successful inside the octagon, but he is the one who captured the now infamous video of Fabricio Verdum hitting Colby Covington with a boomerang in Australia. He, of course, makes weight. He hits his mark. That's 155.5 for Dan Hooker. He's now on the main card. after Jimmy Rivera and John Lineker were pulled due to John Lineker's tooth infection. That's Dan Hooker. He'll be meeting Marc Casey on Saturday. We now say hello to the first ever UFC Women's Strawweight Champion. She won the Ultimate Fighter several years back. Her name is Carla Esparza. She's also the former Invicta Strawweight Champion. You saw her opponent Cynthia Calvillo weigh in moments ago. Now it is time for Carla Esparza to weigh in. She's flanked by Colin Oyama, and she hits her mark as well. That's 115.5 for Carla Esparza. She has a smile on her face. The Cookie Monster is in great spirits. An important fight for her to remain atop the strawweight division rankings. We now say hello to Marc Casey. The Bone Crusher is here. So we're completing some fights right off the bat. We say hello to Marc Casey, who steps on the scale. We just saw his opponent, Dan Hooker. Casey looking to get back on track after stumbling earlier this year. $155.5 for Marc Casey, one of the bright young stars coming out of England. They call him the Bone Crusher. He is coming off the first loss of his mixed martial arts career. He lost to Drakkar Klose back at the Ultimate Fighter 25 finale in July. He's looking to get back on track tomorrow night against Dan Hooker.
Marc De La Rosa.
And now we say hello to Marc De La Rosa, who will be making his UFC debut. Great story here. Marc De La Rosa and his wife Montana will become the first married couple who are active fighters in the UFC. De La Rosa hits his mark, taking this fight on short notice against Tim Elliott. He is undefeated, 9-0 as a professional. Tim Elliott, of course, was supposed to compete just a couple of weeks ago in Winnipeg against Pietro Menga. That fight fell through, and they called upon Marc De La Rosa, who has been competing the regional scene for quite some time and considered one of the top prospects in the bantamweight division. He now joins his wife on the active roster, Montana De La Rosa. Speaking of Tim Elliott, there he is. Tim Elliott stepping on the scale, flanked by current UFC fighter James Krause. He is on the scale. He looks over at the media. No doubt a heavy heart for Tim Elliott heading into this one. His coach, Robert Follis, passing away earlier this month. He hits his mark, Tim Elliott does. That's 135 for Mr. Elliott. So it appears as though he has a fight, but he is no doubt fighting with a heavy heart, as his coach, who he moved to Las Vegas for, Robert Follis, tragically took his life earlier this month. He's been very open about the fact that he moved to Las Vegas for the late Robert Follis, one of the greatest coaches in MMA history, and it will certainly be interesting to see how he responds tomorrow in the face of that adversity. Moving right along, we say hello to Miles Jury now. Miles Jury is scheduled to meet Rick Glenn on tomorrow night's prelims. Walking in with his shades on, 16-2 as a professional for Miles Jury. He has not fought since April. He's coming off a win over Mike De La Torre. One of the interesting characters in the UFC on the roster. He is stepping on the scale with the glasses. This is something that we don't often see. 146, for Miles Jury. That's 146 with the glasses. 146 for Miles Jury. His future so bright he had to wear the sunglasses. Looking to go 2-0 in his last two fights. Still threat in the UFC's featherweight division. That's Miles Jury. And how about this? Cris Cyborg walking in, greeted by cheers, spoke to her nutritionist earlier, Rob Emerson, former UFC fighter, said it was the best weight cut of her career. We're about to see her step on the scale. There she is, Cris Cyborg, the reigning defending UFC women's featherweight champion, and she hits her mark. That's 145 for Cris Cyborg. Big smile on her face. She appears to be in great spirits, a long ways away from those days where she was crying and shivering and aching and dealing with all kinds of aches and pains as she tried to hit 140. There's Tito Ortiz, her mentor, in the house as well. The reigning defending UFC women's featherweight champion, Cris Cyborg. She comes and goes, hits her mark like a true professional, and that means one half of the headlining act on Saturday night is now official. Cris Cyborg hits her mark, and now we await the arrival of one Holly Holm. Before that, though, we will say hello to Edson Barbosa. Early this morning, we saw Khabib Nurmagomedov weigh in. This is his opponent, Edson Barbosa. He's won his last 3 in a row. He's on some kind of roll, perhaps the best of his career, considering the talent that he's faced. And now here he is in phenomenal shape, stepping on the scale.
155.
That's 155. That's championship weight for Edson Barbosa. He hits his mark. 155 for Brazil's own Edson Barbosa. He's here with the great Mark Henry, his striking coach. What a run it has been for them. The Ricardo Almeida fight team based in New Jersey. And so that means the Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Edson Barbosa fight is official. That's the co-main event on Saturday night. A very important fight in the lightweight division. And it's interesting to note that all the contenders at 155 always talk about Tony Ferguson being the man they want to fight next, not Conor McGregor. It's almost like they pretend that Conor doesn't exist anymore, that he's not really the official champion. It's very interesting because Conor is, of course, the money fight, but it doesn't seem like a lot of them, at least right now, believe that he will ever be coming back. Noticed that yesterday. Here comes Michal Oleksiejczuk, the Hummer, 12-2 as a professional. He meets Khalil Roundtree. He replaces the injured Gokhan Saki, making his UFC debut. He fights out of Poland. He's on some kind of winning streak, stepping on the scale for the first time as a UFC fighter. He's won his last 9 fights in a row. And the Hummer hits his mark. That's 2:03.5. He was supposed to make his UFC debut back at UFC 217 in November. Unfortunately, Ion Kuchilaba was pulled due to a USADA doping violation. The preacher's daughter, Holly Holm, on the verge of history. She could become the first female fighter in UFC history to hold a belt in 2 different weight classes and the first to defeat the great Ronda Rousey and Cris Cyborg. She steps on the scale.
$144.
And she hits her mark, 144. She doesn't have to cut a lot of weight. As a featherweight, she's 1 pound under. This is her second time fighting at 145 in the UFC. Of course, made a name for herself at 135. She is the former women's bantamweight champion, and so that means the headlining act tomorrow night, the main event of UFC 219, is set. Holly Holm 144, Cris Cyborg 145. Say hello now to Omari Akhmedov. About to step on the scale. That's Omari Akhmedov. He meets the Italian Marvin Vettori. Here's Dagestan's Omari Akhmedov stepping on the scale. He's won his last 2 in a row.
185.5.
And that's 185.5 for Omari Akhmedov. He is official. Has wins over Kyle Noak and Abdul Razak Al Hassan, looking to go 3-0 in his last 3 fights. And this is notable after he lost 2 in a row. He has turned things around here, looking to pick up his second victory of 2017. This is the UFC's traditional year-end event. One of the big stories on this particular card. As we await his arrival, as I said, one of the big stories on this card is the return of the natural-born killer. There he is. Say hello once again to Carlos Condit. He is back. One of the most popular fighters in the UFC, took a break from active competition. He has not fought since August of 2016, and he returned to great fanfare. Earlier this year, announced his return. He meets Neil Magny tomorrow night, and he is official. There he is. Carlos Condit with a smile on his face. Welcome back, Carlos. A lot of fans excited to see the natural-born killer back. He is now official for his fight against Neil Magny. We await the arrival of one Neil Magny. Great to see Carlos Condit back, the former WEC welterweight champion, the former UFC interim welterweight champion. Was oh so close to becoming the official champion back at UFC 195. Close fight against Robbie Lawler. He walks off with a smile on his face. Great to have Carlos Condit back. We say buongiorno now to Marvin Vettori, the Italian-born fighter, a favorite of one Lorenzo Fertitta. They call him the Italian Dream. He fights out of Italy. 12-3 as a professional, coming off a win over Vitor Miranda.
No, but I don't think mom will get out. Okay.
185.5.
185.5 for Marvin Vettori. He is a very confident young man. He meets Omari Akhmedov, 12-3 as a professional, as I just said. He's excited to get back in there. In fact, the last loss of his professional career came exactly a year ago. The year-end event, UFC 207, looking to exercise those demons on Saturday night. We say goodbye to Marvin Vettori. We say hello to Mateus Nicolau, 12-1-1 as a professional, fighting out of Belo Horizonte in Brazil. He's coming off a split decision victory over John Moraga, and he meets Luis Smolka on Saturday night. Here he is, flyweight contender in the UFC. And he hits his mark. That's 125.5 for Mateus Nicolau of Brazil, 24 years young. Looking to pick up his third UFC win. He was a member of the Ultimate Fighter Brazil Season 4. Those are considered exhibition bouts. But since fighting officially in the UFC, he is 2-0. If you're joining us late, it is currently 9:23 a.m. Pacific time. Cris, Cyborg, Holm, Khabib Nurmagomedov, and Edson Barbosa, they've all successfully made weight. Here comes Rick Glenn, coming off a fantastic performance in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, a win over Gavin Tucker.
145 and a half.
145.5 for Rick Glenn. His fight against Miles Jury is now set, looking to go 3-0 in 2017. After losing his last fight in 2016 against Evan Dunham, he has turned things around with a win over Philippe Nover and then the brutal beatdown of Gavin Tucker. And here he is, Luis Smolka, stepping on the scale. $126 for Luis Smolka, Hawaiian Zone. They call him the Last Samurai. Flanked by former UFC fighter Elliott Marshall, training out of Colorado, of course. Big fight for him on Saturday against Carlos Condit. He steps on the scale. That's 170.5 for Neil Magny. So that means his fight against Carlos Condit is official. 170.5 for Mr. Magny, coming off that loss to Rafael Dos Anjos, lost via first round submission. Back at UFC 215 in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. He's lost 2 of his last 3. He's got a win over Johnny Hendricks, which is on the card that ended last year, UFC 207. Prior to that, he had a loss to Lorenz Larkin at UFC 202, which ended up being the last fight of Lorenz Larkin's UFC career, at least for now. Comes Khalil Roundtree, the last fighter set to make weight. It's 9:58 a.m. Pacific, so we could wrap this up before 10 a.m. Just pretty darn quick. Roundtree steps on the scale. And the Warhorse hits his mark. That's 205 for Khalil Roundtree. Has won his last 2 fights in a row. Looking to make it 3 in a row on Saturday at UFC 219. 20 fighters have stepped on the scale. 20 fighters have officially made weight. UFC 219 is set for Saturday night. T-Mobile Arena here in Las Vegas. The 5-fight main card is set for pay-per-view. The prelims on Fight Pass and FS1. The big news, of course, Khabib Nurmagomedov, the second fighter to step on the scale. He makes his weight. His fight against Edson Barbosa is official. And then Cris Cyborg and Holly Holm, the women's featherweight title fight, is set as well. Cris Cyborg making her weight relatively easily, according to her team earlier this morning. It's all coming down Saturday night on pay-per-view, FS1, and Fight Pass. We appreciate you checking out our coverage of the UFC 219 official weigh-ins. Later today, we'll have coverage of the UFC 220 press conference and, of course, the ceremonial weigh-ins. For now, we'll say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from Las Vegas. We'll see you later on today for more coverage from here in Sin City.